Okay, welcome everyone to the Lunch and Learn for today. We are going to be talking about navigating the legislative landscape and the trends, challenges, and opportunities that come with that. Our presenters are Elizabeth Higgins, who is the Senate Minority General Counsel and Policy Advisor, Michael Hans, the Policy Advisor for the Senate Democratic Staff, and Rhonda Barnes, the House Minority Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel. Your moderators are going to be me, Keisha Mohan, Cindy Walsh, and Penny Sharon. So for today's program, we're going to have a welcome by the League of Women Voters of Arizona President, Penny Sharon, and a review of the logistics and an introduction of the moderators. Then the moderators are going to introduce the presenters, and then we will have a Q&A handled as time permits, which will be curated by the moderators. Followed by that, we will have a closing. So some tips for today's Lunch and Learn event. Please mute your microphone and please do not use the chat feature to ask questions. We have several presenters, moderators, and hosts, and they will not be able to see the questions you ask. Please do post your questions in the Q&A tool available on your webinar toolbar. And time permitting, the moderator will present questions to the speakers. As for unanswered questions, the LWVAZ advocacy team will do our very best to get answers from the speakers and share those with the people registered for the event. You can contact us at lwvazadvocacy@gmail.com. And today's session is being recorded. And it will be available on the YouTube channel. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to our president now, Penny Sharon.
Thank you all. Appreciate everybody joining us for our last of our 5-part series on Lunch and Learn during our legislative week. My name is Penny Sharon, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Arizona. But before I get started, I want to do a slightly more robust introduction of our two fabulous moderators. Let's start with Keisha Mohan. Keisha is our intern and also are part of our legislative analysis team for voting rights bills and elections bills. And we're delighted she's taking the time to do that. She plans on giving us a lot more time when she graduates this year. She does a gap year before starting law school. So Keisha, we thank you for all your work, and I'm so delighted you're joining Cindy to moderate this. I'd like to say a couple of words about Cindy, just so you all are aware why Cindy is so valuable in the work we do in lobbying. We have a formal lobbying team. I serve as the designated lobbyist, but Cindy Walsh, for the last 3 years, has been developing the testimonies that we present either in person or in writing for all the bills that we either support or oppose across many issues. Our primary issues of interest have been voting rights in elections, climate, education, and women's rights. And I am so delighted to have both Keisha and Cindy moderate today's very important discussion. But before we get started, I'd like to make sure we frame our discussion today in the context of the mission of the League, which is to empower voters and defend democracy. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. We are an all-volunteer, nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights, to make sure that everybody is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy, which is part of the work we're doing as our legislative lunch and learns. Education, which is also part of the work we do, which is not just to advocate, but to educate and advocate. And we also are unafraid to bring forward litigation at the local, state, and national levels when matters reach the necessity for litigation. We take action on an issue only when we have a position to address it. And members who have not studied and come to consensus on it, then the league has no position. So we take something between 1 to 3 years to study a position, arrive at consensus and a position using both positive and negative data as we develop that policy. Today, before I turn it over to Cindy and our fabulous presenters, I want to also put a frame around the work we know in front of us for the first 100 days of this administration and through the 2025 calendar. Our framework for defending democracy is based on our belief that it is prudent to do the most about those things we can do the most about. So we do pick and choose what issues do we have that are our primary priorities, and what is it that we have the capacity to respond to, and we are also have the expertise to respond to. In this current 100 days and into the 2025 calendar, our campaign is Women Defend Democracy campaign. And we're going to lead with our League Gold Star standard priorities. The first one is democracy, education, and election administration support. The second is to restore and defend voting rights protection. The third is to abolish the electoral college. We believe in the popular vote and one person, one vote. And protecting democracy organizations and institutions. And more important, and finally, reproductive freedom. We work very hard with the groups that help to pass the initiative to protect women's right to abortion. And we oppose any efforts to a national abortion ban. With that, I thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Walsh. Okay. Cindy, if you would start your video, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Penny. It's great to have our legislative staff with us today. As we go through this, today we're joined by these members of the minority staff that Keisha shared their names, and we're going to meet them further in a second. They will give us a glimpse of what really happens behind the scenes in policymaking, from negotiations and committee debates to the influence of lobbyists, party leaders, and political public pressure. But by pulling back the curtain on the strategies and compromises and procedural moves to shape legislation, we can help all league members better understand why bills succeed while others don't. Their expertise can empower us to stay informed, hold leaders accountable, and take an active role in advocating for legislation that benefits all Arizonans. And just a note about the League for a second. We have a long history of working on researching and analyzing issues and bills in the legislature. And there is a dedicated group of League members who do this work. I'm one of the leaders of the group and one of the authorized lobbyists. This team educates and advocates through robust research and analysis. The research allows us to take a stand supporting or opposing proposed legislation. Each week, we reach out to our members with the critical issues for the legislative week through a call to action and urge our members to use RTS to reinforce our message. So with that, part of that introduction, I'm going to hand this off to Rhonda Barnes, who is the House Minority Deputy Chief of Staff and the General Counsel for the House. And she can share with us some of the things that she's seeing in the House during this beginning of this session.
Thank
Rhonda?
you, and I apologize for being off camera, folks. I was driving into the office for this, and there was a vehicle fire on the freeway, and we've been stopped, so I'm just starting moving again, but I'm going to stay off camera for that purpose. But thank you. I'm happy to be here. I think I've talked to the League a few times over the last few years. One of the things I focus on at the legislature is elections policy. Prior to my time at the legislature, I was an elections litigator. So it's sort of been my passion and my professional focus for many years. This is my 14th legislative session. So I've seen a lot. And My roles include being a policy advisor for wherever elections go, which over the years has been a variety of different committees. And right now the House has a committee called Federalism, Military Affairs, and Elections. But 99% of the bills that go through it are elections. We do very little of anything else in that title. So if you're trying to track stuff down, look for, I call it FMA in the House. And then also just a couple of election bills initiatives in particular have gone to government committee this year. So if you're interested in following initiative changes, you may have to look at government committee also. The other thing I do at the legislature is I staff the rules committee like my colleague Elizabeth in the Senate. So we're always looking for unconstitutional issues, you know, from a voting perspective, looking at the National Voter Registration Act, HAVA, the Civil Rights Acts, including the Voting Rights Act. And so we're looking at sort of whether to what Penny was saying before, the sort of rolling back of voter suppression measures, trying to advocate for that in the House. I'll say my 2 cents about RTS, which I think I'm like the lone voice on this. I know a lot of folks like to get on to request to speak and register their issues on that, but I do know that most members don't see it. The only time they see it is if they actively sign in to RTS and look at a particular bill. So I do encourage, if you have the time, to actually call your legislator's office or find the email of the folks on the committees and reach out to them directly. They're much, much more likely to see that than a comment on RTS. Frankly, a lot of times all they'll see is that there's 300 people registered in opposition and they don't necessarily even look at the comments. So it is definitely a tool, but I think one that maybe gets kind of lost in the noise for members. You know, you've got to remember that our members sit on multiple committees, and here this past week in the House, we had about 200 bills that went to the floor. And so it gets just so lost in sort of all of that that's going on. And it's just so much. So I'm going to stop there and hit it over to my colleagues in the Senate. I'm happy to answer questions. I can't stay the full time. I'm sorry. But if anybody needs to get a hold of me, I'm in the House and happy to do what I can to support the league. Thanks.
Thanks, Rhonda. Elizabeth and Mike, I'm going to go through the bio, and I'm sorry, Rhonda, I skipped over your robust bio. Elizabeth is a native Arizonan, and she started her career working with Harry Mitchell, both as a state senator and when he served as the House of Representatives. And after a short time in private practice, she went to work for the city of Tempe as the chief of staff for the mayor and for the city council, and was there for over 2 years. In 2023, Elizabeth was hired as the general counsel to the Arizona Senate Democratic Caucus, and is currently advises the caucus and acts as a senior policy advisor. She went to ASU for undergrad and in political science and psychology, and graduated from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. So welcome, Elizabeth. And I'm going to jump to Mike as well, because they're going to do a tag team here. Mike is policy advisor for the Senate Democratic staff, also a native Arizonan. And this is Mike's 11th legislative session. So you've seen almost all of it. I'm not sure we're done seeing new things. Currently staffs the Arizona Senate's Government, Judiciary, and Elections Committee and Federalism Committees. And previously worked as a legislative research analyst for the Senate Committee on Government for 4 years. Mike has worked as a legislative research analyst in the Arizona House in committees on government, local and international affairs, children and family affairs, and transportation. He graduated from a University of Arizona with a BA in political science. So on to you two for an introduction, and we'll see what we have in the question Q&A section.
Okay, I will go first. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Higgins. Thank you so much for that introduction. So a little bit more about me. So my very first job out of college was working here at the Senate as a Senate assistant to Senator Harry Mitchell. That's how I first met him. And so I worked for him for about 3.5 years. And then I left to go to law school at Arizona State University. And while I was there, he decided that he was going to run for Congress. And so he ran for Congress toward the end of my first year, and I actually did my first summer working with him in his campaign. And then when he was elected, I joined his congressional staff in 2007, so like halfway through my my law school career. And so I did both. I worked for him full time, and I did law school pretty much full time, but maybe a little bit of a lighter load. It took me an extra semester to graduate. So that was how I first started working in politics. So did 4 years, his full 4 years with the U.S. House of Representatives, oversaw constituent services with him, saw some really exciting legislation like the Affordable Care Act being put into place, and made a lot of good connections there. And then I had graduated from law school, taken the bar when he was unelected. And then I worked in private practice for about 1.5 years before I went over to work for his son at the city of Tempe. And so I was actually at the city of Tempe for a total of 10.5 years. So 8 years I was with the mayor and the council as chief of staff. And then I did the last 2.5 years as assistant city attorney. And then came over back here to the Senate. So I've worked at all 3 levels of government, state, local, and federal. I've seen a lot over those years. I'm glad to be back at the Senate. I think there's always good work to be done here from our staff perspective. That you need a strong minority to stand up to some of the ideas and bills that go through, so that you can have a good, robust process of lawmaking. So I can take any questions that you have about any of my background, but I will turn it over to Mike.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm Mike Hans. As Cindy said, this is my 11th legislative session. I started in 2015 as a House page. And then that summer, an opportunity opened up on their research staff. So I spent 3 years in the House, 4 years on Senate research before joining our Democratic staff here. In that time, a majority of my time in the legislature, I have staffed largely government and elections issues. Elections in sort of several different formats. When I first started, it was sort of under the government committee, and while it was a decent amount of the bills we saw, it certainly was not the majority. Obviously, the last half decade, that's changed. It has become a topic that I think has a lot more air, a lot more members of the legislature introducing bills in that subject area, to the point to where it became its own individual committee for a couple of years, and now beginning this session was sort of folded into judiciary, which itself was a very busy committee. So we're kind of seeing what that looks like so far. It's been sort of 50-50 in the bills that we've seen. But certainly, to Cindy's point, legislature never ceases to surprise me with some of the things we see, and I don't expect it's going to stop anytime soon. Definitely want to uplift Rhonda's point about how important it is to reach out to individual members of the legislature, especially if you're within their district. They do see that, and they do read those and take that to heed. But I also want to uplift the League of Women Voters as a collective, how important your voice is to our members as well. For those of you who, for some reason, tuned into the floor session this week, you would have seen our Senator Kuby actually read your direct comments into the record on one of the bills because they were so important to her. So Cindy, if you wrote those, which I bet you did, thank you so much. But really just want to thank you all for the work that you do and let you know how much ourselves and our members truly appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Mike. It's nice to know that it goes somewhere besides, just to the committee members. So I appreciate that. As we have questions come in, I'm going to jump in and ask a question. And it's like, one of the things we're seeing in voting this year, and I think we saw it in the last 2 sessions too, is that we'll see a bill go through. And I think 2703 is an example of that. It got through both houses. It was sent to the governor, and the governor vetoed it. But we're now seeing, I don't know if it's an HCR or an SCR, that is trying to put a similar kind of issue on the ballot. And do you foresee that type of legislating by these sessions to continue?
Yes. So short and sweet, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're trying to get around the governor.
And yet there was lots of feedback that said that having the number of ballot measures that we had on this last ballot caused voter fatigue, caused some, incomplete ballots, and also saw some frustration for our voters. And our speculation, my personal speculation, is that is some of the intent, is to overwhelm voters. What's your take on that?
I think that's certainly been a concern that's been expressed by a number of our members. I would agree with Rhonda. I don't think that, if anything, it appears that there may be an effort to sort of double down and increase the number of things going to the ballot, just based off some of the comments we've seen from legislators themselves saying, I know what's going to happen with this bill. It's going to be vetoed, and then we're going to put it on the ballot. I've heard that on a lot of bills in my own committees, and I'm sure it's being said in other committees as well.
Okay.
And
Cindy, I'm going to ask a follow. Go ahead, and I want to ask a follow-up question to Cindy's. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so in many years, through the the legislative session is 2 years, right? We start in an odd number year and they go to the election year, and it's all the same folks. So a lot of times, historically, they would put the ballot measures in the even numbered year. So you would see stuff going to the ballot the year of the ballot, right? But this year, as Mike was pointing out, there's ballot referrals in all the committees. I mean, we have at least half a dozen moving in the House, and that's unusual for an even number or an odd numbered year, because they do kind of tend to fill up the ballot as we get closer to election time. So if they refer half a dozen things this year, then who knows how many they could put on next year. And I can imagine that we'd have an even longer ballot with more ballot measures, even though I would like to point out they were wildly unsuccessful. They passed, I think, 4 of 11 that they referred last time. So their policies are unpopular, but they keep trying.
And to that point, many of them also, the percentage of the vote that they got was overwhelmingly against. It wasn't like all of these were, barely losing on the ballot. They were overwhelmingly rejected by voters.
So my follow-up question, Cindy, to build that conversation a little bit further, because of the work we do on the ballot side, is that what are some strategies that we can employ and some messaging to the representatives in our districts that we don't like these we don't like the use of the ballot initiative to pass laws that they weren't able to pass at the legislature, and they've certainly proved they can't pass it at the ballot box either. Okay, so talk us through some of those, Elizabeth, Mike, and Rhonda, please.
Yeah, it's a hard one, because I think it's a very purposeful strategy that they have right now, right? Like everything that they have kind of a stake in, and you can see it from budget measures to tax measures at city levels, to elections, to immigration. They're doing this on a number of fronts, because they know, and they don't want to compromise, they know that these ideas will not be popular with the governor's office, and they won't be popular with at least half of our state. That it's their absolute strategy, and I think it causes them some problems too, because even this year they sent I think one to the ballot in 2023 that was a death benefit bill, but it also had some changes to the aggravated assault statutes in it. And now you're seeing bills this session that are trying to clean those things up, because in the year that passed, where they sent it to the ballot, there was still another legislative session, and changes happened in the aggravated assault statutes. And so Leg Council has to kind of look at those bills and say, how do you put these things together now? So it definitely causes some, logistical headaches, but it also is going to be very tough for the voters to have to weed through those things. And, you know, when we have democratic ideals, because, you know, the initiative process is one that our public uses to put forth ideas that are popular throughout the state and that can get that vote on the ballot. It becomes very hard to message one as a yes and everything else as a no. So, I mean, it is a difficult thing, but I think it's a very purposeful strategy that they're employing.
Yeah, it's clear it's a strategy, and I know it frustrates voters, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, and I definitely think it, again, is worth sort of letting your legislator know, I don't like this. I don't like seeing this many things on the ballot. I don't like that I have to comb through the entire publicity pamphlet and spend a week doing research in order to fill out my ballot. I mean, voters have shown that that is not popular with them. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and that I think very much depends on what the actual measure is. But I think some of the arguments that historically would give members of the majority party pause don't appear to be as successful. The logistical ones, we really need to make sure that this is thought through, and this proposal, every line has been looked over because it's going to be voter protected. Those concerns don't appear to really have as much weight. I think, Rhonda, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think a lot of this happened in the House, but I believe it was the very last day of session in 2024, they put on 5 ballot referrals that hadn't been moving at all in the previous month or so. And it seemed like there was not any sort of strategy other than throwing everything they could at the wall and seeing what would stick.
Mike, there's a question that I'm going to answer just so people are aware of this. It's not so much from you, but from us as the league. Keisha, I'll take that question. The individual asking, we urge you, if you're not a member of the league, sign up to get our newsletters, because we send out weekly newsletters about the bills that are being considered and what you ought to do from an RTS. It'll include information about the phone number and the email for the committee members, which is very important. You've got to push them, and you've got to make sure your voice is heard. So we urge you to do that. Keisha, if you'll put in the chat the LWBAZ advocacy email, then it would be great for them to contact us through that. Before we take a couple more questions that are on the Q&A, Cindy, I want to ask you all a little bit about, in this time, so many of us feel a sense of despair. Are you seeing any possibility that there might be more bipartisan movement on certain fronts than other fronts? Can you speak to that both at the House or the Senate side?
Rhonda, I know you have to leave soon. If you're still on, want to go first, otherwise me and Elizabeth can answer. She may have already, I know she had another meeting starting at 12:30, but yeah, I mean, there's certainly areas where you see the two sides wanting to work together. And there being sort of more bipartisan conversations happening. I mean, it's not an area that I staff, but I think certainly housing is one where you're seeing a lot of conversations about that. Water is one where there is obviously, both sides agree that there is a problem here and are at least willing to sort of come to the table and have a conversation about it. I'm not at that table, so I can't weigh in on how those conversations are going currently, but I know that they are happening, and they are, the top of mind for both parties.
So a follow-up question to that is, they're going to have to get into budget discussions and negotiations, and they need more than a simple majority to move anything forward on that front. So are we seeing places where there is some agreed movement, if you will, together?
I'm not sure about the actual, can't speak to the specifics of what will be a portion of the budget at this point. I think those conversations are very much ongoing, and as we've seen the last couple of years, are ongoing up until almost the deadline in June for those to occur. But yeah, that's another example where it is the reality of this system that we have right now, is there is a Republican majority legislature and a Democratic governor. So all three parties, including our caucus, do need to be a part of that conversation, because you kind of need buy-in across the board if you're going to pass a budget. And I don't think anyone wants to get to June 30th without one and find out what happens then.
Yeah, I think it's the same process every year, right? It's Republicans thinking that they can do it on their own, they can get the votes on their own, and you know, this year there are a few more Republicans than there were last year. And so they wait and they wait and they wait until the point where it's like basically they have to decide if they're going to include us or they're not going to include us. And they're having talks, you know, with the governor the whole time. I'm sure they're having them now. We don't staff the budget, luckily, thank goodness. But yeah, it seems like it's the same process that repeats itself every year. And then, you know, there's sort of this package that's sort of put forward and then a scramble at the end to try to get the requisite number of votes to pass it. So, and Rhonda did text me. She did have to peel off, but she said, thank you so much for this opportunity and she appreciates it. And she's sorry she had to leave so early.
Yeah. We appreciate her trying to, you know, be a part of that and under a challenging circumstance.
Yeah.
So
Keisha, we've got some questions, I think.
oh, sorry, I was going to say, we have a couple questions in our Q&A. So this is going back to what you said earlier about reaching out to legislators. Someone asked, where can voters look for current legislation so we can contact House and Senate members?
I think I answered that question, Keisha, as to where they can contact us. You want to go to the next one?
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Someone else asked, do the legislators care about what voters have to say outside of their district?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it probably mostly depends on the legislator. In the past, you know, the folks that I worked for when I worked for Harry Mitchell, you know, because obviously, well, I think it was a little bit different then because now when you log into, or if you go onto azleg.gov and you go to email your legislature, you put in your information and then they tell you which is your legislator and then you send the email directly to them. It used to be like you could sort of massively email everybody, and you can still do it if you know the way that the emails normally work, where it's first letter, last name at azleg. But he always would ask me like, well, you know, what are we hearing? What's coming into the email? So, I mean, I think there is a benefit, especially if they're hearing from a lot of folks about something that they understand that it has a larger impact than their own district. And I do think that makes a difference. I don't hear a lot of folks talking about it specifically, but you know, I think flooding a person's email address with your thoughts about something is always going to make someone pay attention. So
yeah, and I think it also, a lot of members, while it might not be framed in that they want to hear from people outside of their district, they do want to know logistically if a proposal can work across the state. And I think like in voting, for example, I have a lot of members who maybe their district is entirely composed within Maricopa County or within the Phoenix metro area. But if they're getting their inbox flooded with, this is not going to work in rural areas, this is not going to work in tribal communities, they do take that to heart, even if they don't represent those communities. And I think that's the way a lot of members look at it is, will this proposal work for the state? Because while I represent this district, they still want to make sure if they're voting yes on something, it's not going to only help their district and not work anywhere else.
yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And then another question from an attendee. They said, we have heard in the past from lobbyists that presenting to the legislature for or against bills has been fairly hostile. Is the environment now like that?
It depends on the committee chair, for sure. And there are some committee chairs that will challenge a person when they come up, especially if they disagree with them on a measure. And sometimes they are not gracious about it. And we definitely have had complaints. And it is an awful situation because you have a person who is just, you know, coming from the public and spending their own time to do so. And then they get here and they might think that they're able to testify on a bill. And the committee chairman will also just say, well, I'll take 3 people from each side and you have 1 minute to speak, which obviously, you know, in the larger scheme of making the sausage or, you know, making laws is not a great way to do it, right? You want to be hearing from folks. You want to be getting that public input. And I think there is a real concerted effort to avoid that sometimes, and to make it uncomfortable for the person so that the next person who is on the list to go up and speak, you know, they don't want to follow that, and they don't want to put themselves in a situation where they're going to be yelled at on camera, and have it be, you know, a public video that anyone could go and look at. So I do think it is an effort of a lot of chairmen or chairpersons to do that. And there are the few of those that really do it. I think most chairs are pretty gracious, but it always can happen, and tempers can always flare, especially in a committee too.
Yeah, I think definitely depends on the committee, depends on what's on the agenda, not only what bill are you speaking on, but, you know, what was discussed just before that. You know, our tension's a little bit higher in that hearing that day. In my time at the legislature, there's always been one or two chairpersons who, you know, sort of have had a reputation of, you know, there's a bit more hostile exchanges back and forth, you'll say. I would agree. I think it's become a bit more widespread and normalized in recent years. I think it sort of happens in more committees. And I also think, yeah, it's weaponized and used sort of strategically, it seems like at times. And it's definitely, we've seen a normalization of, like Elizabeth was saying, that reducing the amount of testimony that's going to be offered. We don't see nearly as many committee hearings where a bill takes 3 hours because there's 50 people signed in to speak on it. That just doesn't happen as often as it used to before, and that's because of sort of the constraints that are often put on, you know, 3 people for, 3 people against, 90 seconds each, then we vote.
Before we jump out of, go ahead, Elizabeth, but before we jump to the next question, I have a follow-up to this particular topic. Go ahead, Elizabeth, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's also why it's important and so important that groups like yours are involved. You know, having worked at the city level, there are many nights that we sat in a city council meeting for hours and hours while every single member of the public got up and spoke, and they got their 3 minutes. And you know, that the fact that people just, you know, the legislature maybe just seems like a little bit further away from you than your local government, but the laws that we pass here have an absolute impact on people's lives, everyday lives. So your work, getting people involved and encouraging them to contact and reach out, I think that's so important because it actually will build that connection in. I wish more people of more public members would come down here and see what was going on, because I don't think that these chairs would be able to get away with a lot of the behavior that they do, and even some of the legislation that's introduced. I mean, I think if more people were aware of some of the very things that were introduced by these members, that there would be more concern about what happens down here, instead of just hearing those 4 minutes where they discuss the legislature on NPR in the morning. So
yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think to that point too, even if a person is not there to speak and get up and talk into the microphone, there is sometimes a benefit of still having that presence, just being there in the room.
mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's easier to sort of talk someone down if there's 4 people sitting in the room. If it's a full room, even if it's just showing this is something that is important to the community, this is something that the news or the press is going to pick up on, there's a benefit to that too.
Mike and Elizabeth, I want to follow up on this particular topic before we jump to the next one, which is equally critical. And that is, we talked about during committee hearings where the chairs have a little bit more control over who can speak and can exhibit the bad behaviors, and we can't always get a large amount of public. We used to be able to do that till they got almost abusive, both pre-COVID and post-COVID. Here is the question I'd like to have you explore with us and elaborate on, is that once it moves from the committee to the floor, okay, what are strategies that we can use to make those call outs so that you know, on the floor, we are putting pressure not just on one caucus, but potential folks from the other caucus that might be in competitive districts and fearful of, you know, not being back there in 2026. So talk a little bit about that before we kind of move to this next question related to the previous one.
Yeah, I think it's at that point when it goes from, committee, of course, being the last time where the public has a chance to get in and interact with the members on a bill directly face to face. And that's when it gets to the floor, it really is important. That's when it's critical to reach out to members of the legislature, your own members. Even if a member doesn't know what a bill does, you'll hear a lot where, they might not sit on the elections committee, but they'll be like, what is this bill that my email has been blowing up with for the last week and a half? It still puts on their radar, this is important. Even if I have no clue what's in this bill, they'll kind of start being like, okay, I need to start reading through this, picking up with what this is going to be, because I'm going to have to deal with this on the floor in a week.
Yeah,
So,
and I think the same thing. Writing, calling, even asking for a meeting. I mean, I think that if you ask for a meeting, like just a person who calls their own legislator and says, I'd like to meet with you about a bill. I mean, I probably think that the legislator won't have time for the meeting, but they will be told that someone has requested a meeting about that bill and it's a constituent. So, especially if that's happening a lot, they're going to start feeling, oh, there's some pressure around this bill. Maybe I should be looking at it. Maybe I should be looking at it more carefully. Maybe I should be listening to my constituents about their concerns about it. So it's just, I think that communication of email and calling is super important, because I know we do hear that in our caucus, when we have caucus all the time, our members always say, I'm hearing a lot about this bill. I'm getting, my email is full of emails about this bill. So they do definitely pay attention.
Yeah, I think it doesn't happen very often, but you'll see occasionally there are times where if a bill is getting that much attention, it also then results in the bill just being like, we're not going to move this anymore. We don't want to deal with this. This has clearly become a bigger issue than we were expecting it to.
Yeah.
So the important takeaway is we need to make a big issue of all these bills that we are asking our members to pay attention. I want to put a plug in, Cindy. We're going to do this multiple times, and that is, all of you who are on this call, please urge your communities to take a look at the kinds of information we as the league put. We make sure we try to get to the staffers our analysis, so they've got a way to educate the caucus and educate other members who are willing to listen, who might not be from the Democratic caucus, but that are willing to listen and say, here's a nonpartisan group, and here's their analysis of this. I know Mike reached out to us many times in the 2024-2023 and said, what is the league's position on this? What is your analysis? And we always take it from a nonpartisan. What is the harm or good to the voter and the citizens is always forefront of what we do. So we urge you all who are on this call, call your legislators, but you might also want to start calling your neighbors and your friends and family to call the legislators, because you might not be in that person's district, but somebody in your network will be in that district. We are going to need a lot of help, folks, to fight back against bad ballot initiatives, and also under this, just onslaught of really poorly thought through and bad bills. So encourage you to do that. Keisha, I'll turn it over to you for the next question.
Okay, the next question comes from one of the attendees. They asked, due to current events in our government, are you seeing less participation by the public and lobbyists?
Never not participation by lobbyists. They always participate, and there's plenty of them. From the public, I mean, I think it depends on the measure, but there are definitely issues that the public gets excited about and they come down here and testify. I mean, most of the time, I would say, 75% of bills are probably, well, not in our necessary committees, but are usually pretty non-controversial, and they can get the support of the majority of the legislature with no problem. But it is those ones that garner the controversy that gets the attention. But I mean, I definitely think certain segments maybe are more are less likely to come down here right now. I know that there was an article, and I think it was the Arizona Agenda this morning, that was just talking about how LGBTQ plus folks were not coming down as often because they've been warned, you know, that it might not be a safe place for them. So those are the things that are horrible and that are hard to deal with. But I don't know. What do you think?
No, yeah, I completely agree. There are certainly still bills where, you know, people will come in, it's going to be a full room. You'll have people out in the hallway waiting to get in. I do think you definitely see certain communities and people that have been targeted by the legislation less willing to come in and speak before the legislature because of the content in those bills. Some of it, I mean, I do think that there's been a reduction, at least personally, from what I've seen. It seems like hearings have been sort of less busy post-COVID. I think some of that is just, you know, having that 2-year period where we were hybrid for a year and you know, the building wasn't fully open, hasn't fully returned. But I also think that, yeah, the political climate is absolutely having an impact on that as well.
I'd like to ask this question. We were asked this by one of our members, and that is, would there be an appetite to introduce legislation that allowed for virtual testimonies and virtual participation? Because we're a big state, and to have communities that are impacted far away to drive down here, especially when you consider there is no guarantee that the bill will get heard. And we used to see that pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID, where, you know, we had members from rural communities that were concerned about the impact showing up, and then the bill would be not heard because there wasn't time or the chair decided to pull it, but they've driven 3-4 hours to get here. Do you see some appetite on that? And many of those rural communities are, you know, supportive of the current majority. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I can think of a couple of members of our caucus that I could see definitely being interested in something like that. I know we had hybrid test or virtual testimony for, I think it was only one session in 2020. Yeah, there was definitely I think a benefit to that for that exact reason. If, you know, you are several hours away from the legislature, are you going to drive all the way down for a bill that might get held for a reason that's not explained, and you don't even find out until the end of the hearing? So you've sat there for 2 hours in addition to the time it took you to go down. Or, you know, drive all the way down to find out, oh, only 3 people on this side can speak on an issue. I definitely think that there's a benefit to opening it up to allow more voices to be heard in these hearings. But I will say, if you ever do, you know, drive all the way down, if you've gone out of your way to make the trek down to the legislature, communicate that to the members who are on the committee. They might not always listen, but if I'm sure most of our members, if they found out that someone drove 3 hours to speak on a bill, they'll let the chair know, hey, you know, we had someone here who drove all the way down. Can we have one more person speak on this? So please let the members know.
Elizabeth and Mike, I have a question regarding the strikers. Can you talk to us about how the strikers are brought forward? What is the use of the strikers, and what kind of patterns are you seeing? I think it's an area that's not always well understood by us. We want to know a little bit about how that sausage is being created.
Well, typically, I think the striker is I didn't file this idea before the deadline, so now I have one more chance to do this later on in session, is typically what it's used for. You'll see some members will introduce vehicle bills. So either there'll be technical corrections that have no substantive change just so that they have a bill later, or it will be a small little tweak. Like one we see a lot is if someone has an annual report or requirement that it be like posted on their website or something like that, where it's a minor non-controversial change, it'll move through the process without any discussion. And then right at the end, something controversial will go on it. It's always been a tool of the legislature. there's different rules about it. It really varies by who is the speaker or president. I think right now the House has a rule. It does not have to be noticed on the original agenda. I think only, I could be wrong, but at least in the past that has occurred where the first time you find out is 48 hours before the committee hearing that a bill that you had been working on is suddenly now subject to a striker. Over in the Senate, thankfully, they do at least need to notice them. The norm previously was that the notice would have to say generally what the topic was. There have been some members who have gotten creative with that. On the government committee now, all strikers are noted as government being the topic.
Yeah. Or not creative. They're not creative with it.
Yeah.
One word.
So it really is just, we'll find out at 4:59, 48 hours before the hearing, what that bill looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't seen as many maybe this session, which is interesting. And most of the ones I've seen have been on the same subject. Because, like for our Judiciary and Elections Committee, there was several bills on the killing of service and working animals. So like service animals and then like police dogs or horses and things like that. And so what they did was they all got together and then they came up with a compromise and they put that into a striker. I've seen one that was just a very brand new topic that was something that came up that was non-controversial. But I think usually they are, whenever you see a striker, you go, oh gosh, what's that going to be? But I personally, there haven't been as many to our Judiciary and Elections Committee this year. But
yeah, we had in government committee last week, there were 3 that I think the underlying bills were non-controversial, and 3 very controversial strikers were put on. So that's certainly something that's not new. I would agree. I don't think we've actually seen as many this year, that example aside. But of course, we'll see now that we have the House bills over, they tend to get more creative when it's the very last hearing to hear any bill.
Yeah.
We've got an agenda.
They've
got a really big agenda in the Judiciary and Election Committee next week. The agenda's huge. So
yeah, 26 bills.
Yeah, the House was quick to send over their June elections bills this session, I guess. So we have a lot to choose from.
I think we sent them like one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
On the same topic, advancing this question about the use of SERs and HCRs referrals to the citizens for a vote. What we are noticing is that, we have that single subject requirement and compliance at when we do citizens initiatives. And I'm curious about challenges to these referrals. Do they have a different rule for single subject for the legislative referrals to the ballot?
No, they should all be single subject as well. But single subject is it can be very broad in its, sometimes, there's an argument that if it's just under, one sort of larger general topic, that's all germane and then that's all a single subject. But there was a court case a few years ago where they tried to put everything in certain budget bills that didn't get past that session. And that luckily was, the court intervened and did throw that bill out. So there's there's still things in statute that look like they're passed, but they were actually thrown out. But yeah, it should always be a single subject, but sometimes there's broader interpretation about what that is, and sometimes it has to be challenged once that bill passes the legislature.
Yeah, had the pleasure of working on that budget bill when I was on research. I think my fact sheet was 160 provisions just for the floor amendment and touched like 15 different titles. But yeah, there was litigation on HCR 2060 about this topic last election, right?
Yeah.
Which was, in part had some border and immigration components, but there was also fentanyl components, and that went through the court system and ultimately was able to remain on the ballot. So it's certainly something that should be single subject.
Yeah.
But, that is sometimes in the eye of the beholder.
I'd like to draw attention, since we're talking about the judiciary, is what is the general feel in the caucus about the legislation they're trying to bring forward relative to the odd number year elections, the use of odd number year elections for ballot initiatives, and more importantly, the removal of the Independent Judicial Review Board and or the appellate court Commission on Appellate Court Appointments. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's of grave interest to us.
Yeah, so we had I think it was SCR 1020 on the agenda for the final week of judicial elections, which was ultimately heard. So that bill is no longer moving at this point in the Senate. But the ballot referral that was put on last election cycle, the getting rid of the judicial retention for elections for judges, our members were extremely opposed to. If you go back and look at those committee hearings, there was very robust opposition from our members because of, I think, they were quick to point out that this is something that Arizona historically has been proud of. Our system that we use, sort of that was created by Sandra Day O'Connor, it's sort of something that a lot of members of the community are very proud of, but ultimately too, they want the voters to be able to have a voice in that. I think it's not a coincidence that after an election where more judges than normal were removed, immediately they tried to get rid of the ability of voters to remove judges in that manner.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
Tisha, you want to take this question or a comment, I believe?
Yes, so one of our attendees said, remote engagement would also seem to be attractive to the representatives. Are they able to participate in the legislature remotely regarding discussion or voting?
No, they are not. There was some temporary rules during the pandemic that allowed that to happen, but all of those rules have now been, they're off the books. They're off the Senate rules. So no, not anymore. No. They have to be present to vote. And if you're present, you have to vote. You cannot abstain. So in the Senate, in the House, you can abstain, but not in the Senate.
Cindy, it's 1 o'clock. I'm not seeing any other questions
I'm not either.
Yeah, we had one individual raise their hand. We are sorry, but we're not entertaining any verbal questions. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. This is sort of a last call to the attendees to see if they have any questions. Elizabeth and Mike, I do want to ask this question, and it is relative to the rule setting by the Senate and the House. Can you tell us a little bit about the unlimited authority to set those rules, and when can the public push back on their rules because it impinges on our transparency in government or our ability to be part of, it is we the people still, till it becomes he the king or she the queen, so talk to us about that, please.
Yeah, I can handle that one. So a few years ago, there was a case called Puente. I can't remember if it's versus the state of Arizona or who it actually is against, but they sued because a number of legislators, Republican legislators, go to this ALEC conference every year. And in the ALEC conference, there's, a number of sessions, and they're usually discussing, draft legislation. We see a lot of it here at the legislature, where it'll just be their model bill that is introduced into a bill that may or may not actually relate to Arizona law well or not. So there was a challenge of that to say, hey, isn't this a violation of the open meeting law? You've got folks from, the Republicans are the majority, so they technically have to, the thought was, abide by the open meeting law. The court basically said it was because the Constitution requires the Senate and the House to make our own rules, and we had rules in place about when you can have, our rules do, at least for open meeting law, sort of mere open meeting law where you're supposed to have an agenda. It's supposed to be published for a certain amount of time, and that it's a quorum and all of those things. But also the court said, this basically isn't a question that we can answer. It's a non-justiciable question that we feel like there's a separation of powers, and because the Senate makes its own rules, they are able to do what they want. And I think because of that, we saw the changes where we added the public records rule into the Senate rules and to the House rules, which does mirror a lot of the public records law, but it does have some definite differences. And I think especially under this Senate president, we've had probably the most rule changes that the Senate has seen in a long time. I know that before the election, I was kind of doing a look at the previous rules from years and years ago when there was a 15-15 split. You know, there was a thought that possibly we could go 15-15 again. And so I was just kind of getting ready to see if that was going to happen, you know, taking a look at those rules from over 24 years ago as compared to now. And I found that most of the rules in the Senate, at least, are almost exactly the same. There have been more rule changes, I think, under this president than under probably the previous, I don't even know how many, but so yeah, I definitely think that those rules are adopted by a majority of the members that are in this body. And if there is, the problem is there's no real notice on those rules, right? That when we change the rules, we sometimes get a day notice, especially if they schedule it, they think they're going to schedule it for a vote, and then maybe they have a member absent, and then they back off because they don't think that they can maybe pass it. We might get a day notice, but most of the time we get very little notice, and we come in and there is a little piece of paper on all the members' desks that say this is the proposed rule change. So it is difficult, but I think that if there's a rule change that happens, you know, it only takes 16 members to change it back. And so reaching out and having that communication with the members, whether you're in their district or not in these cases, because these are rules that govern how this body works. I think that is something that every Arizonan should have a say in. And so reaching out and contacting those legislators if you have a problem with the rules that have been amended, to let them know why it's bad, why it affects you, and hopefully ask them to and encourage them to change it back, to go back to the previous rule. So we actually just had a rule change this week where they changed, normally if you lose a vote, you have to be on the prevailing side. So the side that won either the bill, you have to be on the prevailing side to reconsider the bill, to bring it back. And they added, or you can be the bill sponsor. So it becomes increasingly difficult now to maybe have some finality to a bill that could be dead. And I think that's last session, there was a legislator who did not change his vote in time to be on the prevailing side, and was never able to get anyone to reconsider it. And so they changed the rules.
Where does the public have access to the rules?
They're on the website, so at azleg.gov. There's on the top it says Senate and it says House, and if you press on that button, it'll say rules, and you can go and look at the current.
And you can go in and look at it. Okay,
yeah.
Good. Yeah, good to know. There's not a day that goes by that I don't learn something new about how all this functions. It's an amazing thing, and a moving target. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, I just see two more. Wait, let's see what we've got up here. Keisha, do you want to? I think we just answered that question, was about the rules and how they change. So we're all good.
Okay.
I think with that, and we're gonna conclude today. And thank you so much for your participation and your education, and giving us some ideas about how we can embrace and enhance our engagement. More phone calls is what I heard, and more emails directly. I'm good at emails. I love sending those. I love all of that piece. And I personally want to thank you all, including Rhonda, who's no longer on with us. I really want to thank you for your help as we try and get our message out to committee members and to members as they're voting on some of these bills that we are not all that happy about, and certainly we're actively opposing. So with that, I will thank you all for your participation, and thank you everybody who attended today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.